In the unforgiving landscape of 1930s Oklahoma, where the Dust Bowl had turned once fertile farmland into a wasteland of broken dreams and desperate survival, unfolds a story that will challenge everything you believe about mercy, redemption, and the power of human compassion to transform even the darkest moments into beacons of hope. This is the remarkable tale of Caleb Cal Thornton, a weathered farmer who faced an impossible choice and proved that sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing life over death. If you're ready for a story that will move you to tears and restore your faith in the power of human kindness to overcome even the most desperate circumstances, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of compassion and second chances. Don't forget to let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. The dust storm that had been building on the horizon all morning finally reached the Thornton farm, just as Caleb was securing the last of his chickens in their reinforced coop. It was March 1935, and the 38-year-old farmer had learned to read the signs of approaching black blizzards that could strip topsoil from a field in minutes and bury a house completely. Cal had been fighting the drought and dust storms for 5 years now, ever since the rains had stopped coming and the great ploughing of the plains had left the earth vulnerable to the relentless Oklahoma winds. His 240-acre farm, which had once supported his family in modest comfort, now yielded barely enough to keep him and his livestock alive. His wife, Rebecca, had died of dust pneumonia 2 years earlier, and his only son had joined the exodus to California, leaving Cal alone with his determination to hold on to the land that 4 generations of Thorntons had called home. As the wall of dust approached, blotting out the sun and turning day into eerie twilight, Cal made his way toward the farmhouse, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth. But as he reached the porch, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. A human voice, weak and desperate, calling out from somewhere near his barn. Cal grabbed the heavy rope he kept for emergencies and plunged back into the strengthening wind, following the sound toward the outbuildings. The visibility was dropping rapidly as the dust cloud approached, and he could barely make out shapes more than a few feet away. "Help me!" the voice called again, and Cal could now tell it was a woman, her words barely audible over the wind, but carrying desperate urgency. He found her collapsed beside the water trough behind his barn, and the sight that greeted him would haunt his dreams for months. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair hanging in matted tangles around a face that was gaunt with starvation and marked by bruises suggesting recent violence. Her clothes were little more than rags, and she was so thin that every bone was clearly visible beneath pale, stretched skin. But it was her eyes that struck Cal most powerfully, dark brown eyes that held a depth of suffering no person so young should ever carry. She looked up at him as he knelt beside her, and when she spoke, her words hit him like a physical blow. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching storm. "Kill me quickly. I can't go on anymore. Just make it fast." Cal stared at her in shock, trying to process what he was hearing. This young woman was begging him to end her life rather than help her find a way to continue living. "Mom," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm, "I'm not going to kill you, but I am going to get you inside before this storm hits, and then we're going to figure out how to help you." She tried to pull away, but she was too weak to offer real resistance. "You don't understand," she said, tears beginning to mix with dust on her cheeks. "They're coming for me. When they find me, what they'll do will be worse than death. Please, just end it now while I still have some dignity left." Cal could see the terror in her eyes, and he understood that whatever had brought this young woman to his farm had been something far worse than simple poverty or hunger. Someone had hurt her badly, and she was so afraid of what might happen next that death seemed like mercy. "Listen to me," Cal said, lifting her carefully in his arms and noting how little she weighed. "Nobody's going to hurt you while you're on my land. I give you my word on that. But right now, we need to get inside before this storm kills us both." Cal carried her toward the house as the leading edge of the dust storm finally reached them, turning the world into choking, blinding chaos. He managed to get them both inside just as the full force hit, slamming the door behind them and sealing them into the relative safety of his kitchen. Cal's farmhouse was modest but well built, with thick walls and heavy shutters that had been reinforced over the years to withstand the dust storms. He settled the young woman in a chair beside his kitchen table and began the familiar ritual of preparing for a storm siege, lighting kerosene lamps, filling buckets with water, and laying out wet cloths to filter the air. "What's your name?" Cal asked gently as he heated water for tea and began preparing a simple meal. "Mercy," she replied, her voice hollow. "Mercy Coleman. Though I haven't seen much mercy in my life lately." "Well, Miss Coleman, you're safe here. This storm will probably last until tomorrow morning, which gives us time to get some food into you and figure out what's been done to you." Mercy shook her head weakly. "You don't understand. My husband, he's not going to give up looking for me. He has connections, people who owe him favors. When he finds me, he'll kill you just for helping me." Cal set a cup of hot tea in front of her and sat down across the table. "Mercy, I need you to tell me what happened to you." For the next hour, as the dust storm raged outside, Mercy told Cal a story that made his blood run cold. She had been married at 17 to Vernon Coleman, a man 20 years her senior who owned a large cattle operation and had significant political influence. What had seemed like a fortunate match had quickly turned into a nightmare of control, violence, and systematic degradation. "Vernon doesn't think of me as a person," Mercy explained, her voice growing stronger as the hot tea restored some of her strength. "I'm property to him, something he owns. When I tried to leave the first time, he had his men track me down. The beating I got, I was in bed for 3 weeks. How long have you been married to him?" Cal asked. 5 years, and every year it's gotten worse. He does things to me that I can't even say out loud, and he makes sure everyone in town knows that I belong to him, that anyone who helps me will answer to him personally. Cal felt cold fury building as he listened. "How did you get away this time?" "Vernon went to Oklahoma City on business, and he didn't take his usual men. I knew it might be my only chance, so I took some food and what little money I could find and started walking. I've been on foot for 3 days. And you ended up here." "I was heading for the railroad tracks, hoping to catch a freight train to California. But the storm started coming, and I was so tired and hungry that I couldn't go any further." Cal stood and walked to the window, looking out at the wall of dust. "Mercy, I want you to understand something. You asked me to kill you because you thought that would be easier than facing whatever Vernon Coleman might do. But I'm not going to kill you, and I'm not going to let him hurt you either. You don't know what you're saying. Vernon has money, connections, political influence. Maybe so, but I've been fighting dust storms, drought, and economic collapse for 5 years now, and I'm still here. I reckon I can handle one more bully." Mercy looked at him with something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Cal was quiet for a moment. "Because, Miss Coleman, sometimes the only thing that gives a man's life meaning is the chance to do something right when everything else has gone wrong. And because no human being should ever be driven to the point where they're begging for death instead of hope. The healing begins." The dust storm finally exhausted itself just before dawn, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the occasional creak of settling timbers. Cal had dozed fitfully in his chair during the long night, unwilling to leave Mercy alone but too restless to sleep while planning for the challenges that daylight would bring. Mercy had slept deeply for the first time in weeks, curled up on Cal's sofa under the quilt that Rebecca had made. The combination of safety, warmth, and the first adequate meal she'd had in days had allowed her body to finally surrender to exhaustion. When she awoke, Cal was already moving around the kitchen, preparing breakfast and checking the house for storm damage. Through the windows, Mercy could see a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet, everything covered in fine dust, familiar landmarks obscured or buried. "How bad is it out there?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. "Could be worse," Cal replied, setting a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of her. The chickens made it through fine, and I can see most of the cattle. Lost some fence posts and probably half my topsoil, but that's been happening for years. Mercy ate slowly, savoring each bite in a way that spoke of someone who had gone hungry too often. As her strength returned and her thinking became clearer, she began to appreciate the magnitude of what Cal was offering and the risks he was taking. "Cal," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I've been thinking about what you said last night. I'm grateful, but I need you to understand what you're up against." Cal sat down across from her. "Why don't you tell me exactly what kind of man Vernon Coleman is?" Vernon owns the second largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, plus he has interests in oil wells, banks, and local politics. Half the law enforcement officers in the region either work for him or owe their jobs to his influence. When I tried to leave before, he had me tracked down by men who had no qualms about using violence. "What about your family?" Mercy's expression grew pained. "My parents died in a flu epidemic when I was 16. Vernon married me 6 months later, and he made sure I was completely dependent on him. He isolated me from friends and made it clear to everyone that I was his property." "What about legal remedies?" "Laws that would be enforced by sheriffs and judges who owe their positions to Vernon's support. He could have me declared mentally incompetent with a few phone calls." Mercy shook her head. "The law only protects people who have power, Cal." As the morning progressed, they discussed the practical challenges of keeping Mercy safe. Cal began to understand that this wasn't just about providing temporary shelter. He was essentially declaring war against one of the most powerful men in the region. "Mercy," he said, "I need to ask you something. Do you want to fight this, or do you just want to run as far away as possible?" Mercy was quiet for a long moment. 6 months ago, I would have said I just wanted to run. But running means always looking over my shoulder, never being able to build any kind of real life. And now? Now I'm angry. I'm angry that he destroyed 5 years of my life, angry that he made me so desperate I was begging a stranger to kill me. If there's a way to fight him, I want to take it. Cal smiled for the first time since finding her. "Good. Because running would just postpone the problem, and men like Vernon Coleman don't stop until someone makes them stop." Over the next several hours, they developed a strategy. Instead of hiding Mercy or helping her escape, Cal proposed taking the fight directly to Vernon by gathering evidence of his abuse and presenting it to federal authorities, not subject to his local influence. "The key is documentation," Cal explained. "We need medical records of your injuries, testimony from witnesses, evidence of how he's controlled you, and we need to present it to someone with authority and independence to act. But how do we get that evidence without putting ourselves at risk? There's a federal marshal named James Patterson who covers this territory. I met him a few years ago during trouble with cattle rustlers, and he struck me as honest and not impressed by local politics. If we can present solid evidence of federal crimes, kidnapping, conspiracy, civil rights violations, he might take action." "And the evidence?" "We start with Dr. Samuel Morrison in town. He's treated you for injuries, hasn't he?" Mercy nodded reluctantly. "Vernon made sure I went to him after bad incidents. He wanted medical records showing I was accident-prone and mentally unstable. Then Dr. Morrison has documentation of the abuse pattern, even if he didn't recognize it. And I suspect there are others who would speak up if they thought there was real chance of holding Vernon accountable. The plan they developed was risky, but offered something running away never could: the possibility of justice and ensuring Vernon could never hurt anyone else again." As they worked through details, Cal was struck by the transformation in Mercy. The broken, desperate woman who had begged him to kill her was being replaced by someone discovering her own strength. The prospect of fighting back, of taking control instead of simply enduring, was awakening a spirit that abuse had suppressed, but not destroyed. "Cal," she said, as they prepared to begin their plan, "I understand what you're risking for me. If this goes wrong, Vernon will destroy you. Are you sure?" Cal looked at this remarkable woman who had found courage to transform despair into determination. Mercy, for the past 2 years, I've been surviving instead of living, just going through motions while everything turned to dust. But helping you fight Vernon Coleman feels like the first meaningful thing I've done since Rebecca died. If we succeed, we'll have given you back your life. If we fail, at least we'll have tried to do something right. The gathering storm. 3 days after the dust storm had brought Mercy into Cal's life, they began the dangerous work of building a case against Vernon Coleman, strong enough to convince federal authorities to take action. It required moving carefully, gathering evidence, while avoiding the network of informants Vernon had cultivated throughout the area. Their first stop was Dr. Samuel Morrison's office in Clearwater, 15 miles from Cal's farm. Dr. Morrison was a conscientious physician in his 60s who had been serving rural communities for 30 years, and Cal was counting on his professional ethics to overcome any reluctance about getting involved. Mercy had been reluctant to make this visit, knowing Dr. Morrison's office was a place where Vernon might have allies, but Cal had convinced her they needed the medical documentation to establish a pattern of abuse. They timed their arrival for early morning, when the office would be open, but before most of the town would be active. Dr. Morrison's reaction when he saw Mercy was immediate and telling. His face went pale, and he quickly ushered them into his private office, closing the door and checking to ensure they hadn't been followed. "Mercy Coleman," he said quietly, his voice carrying relief and apprehension. "Your husband has been looking for you. He came by 2 days ago asking if I'd seen you, and he made it clear he expected me to contact him immediately if you showed up." "Dr. Morrison," Mercy said, her voice steady despite obvious fear, "I need to ask you about my medical records from the past 5 years. The injuries you treated, did you believe my explanations for how they happened?" Dr. Morrison was quiet, clearly struggling with ethical implications. "Mercy, you know I can't discuss your records without written consent. Patient confidentiality." "I'm giving you my consent," Mercy interrupted. "I want you to tell Mr. Thornton exactly what you've seen, what you've treated, and what you've suspected." The doctor looked at Cal, assessing him carefully. "Mr. Thornton, what's your interest in this matter?" "Dr. Morrison, Mercy came to my farm 3 days ago in a condition that convinced me someone had been systematically abusing her for years. She's asked for my help in gathering evidence to present to federal authorities." Dr. Morrison walked to his filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on his desk with a heavy sigh. "I've been a doctor for 35 years, and I've learned to recognize domestic violence signs even when patients insist they're accident-prone. In Mercy's case, the pattern was unmistakable." Over the next hour, Dr. Morrison reviewed 5 years of medical records that painted a horrifying picture of escalating violence, broken ribs that Mercy claimed resulted from falls, facial bruises attributed to walking into doors, burns on her arms that she said came from kitchen accidents, a dislocated shoulder from allegedly falling off a horse. In every case, Dr. Morrison explained, the injuries were consistent with intentional violence rather than accidents. But Mercy always had an explanation, and Vernon always accompanied her, making it clear he expected me to accept whatever story they provided. "Doctor," Cal asked, "did you ever consider reporting your suspicions? To Sheriff Bradley, who owes his job to Vernon's political support? To the prosecutor who depends on Vernon's campaign contributions?" Dr. Morrison shook his head. "I documented everything carefully, hoping someday there might be opportunity to help Mercy. But going to local authorities would accomplish nothing except putting us all in danger. The medical records provided exactly the documentation they needed, but also confirmed the depth of Vernon's local influence. If they were going to succeed, they needed allies not subject to his political control." Their next stop was Klaus Brenner's farm, adjacent to Vernon's ranch. Klaus had witnessed several incidents that could provide crucial testimony. Klaus was a German immigrant in his 50s who had come to America seeking freedom, and his experiences with European authoritarianism had given him deep hatred of bullies. "Yeah, I have seen things," Klaus said in heavily accented English. "Vernon Coleman thinks because he has money and connections, he can treat people like nothing. I have seen him beat ranch hands for small mistakes. I have seen him threaten shopkeepers, and I have seen how he treats his wife." "What exactly have you seen regarding Mercy?" Cal asked. "3 times, maybe 4. I have seen him drag her from their house to his automobile when she tried to resist going somewhere. Once, I saw him strike her in their yard when she dropped something. And always, she moves like someone who is afraid, who expects to be hurt." Klaus's testimony would be valuable, but he also confirmed their challenges. "You understand, if Vernon learns I have spoken against him, he can make much trouble. He has friends in the bank that holds my mortgage, friends in government offices. But," he added with a grim smile, "I did not come to America to bow down to another tyrant. If you can promise this evidence will be used to stop him, not just anger him, then I will testify." And as the day progressed, Cal and Mercy visited 3 more families who had witnessed Vernon's behavior or been victims of his intimidation. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. People were willing to help if they could be assured their testimony would result in Vernon's downfall rather than simply provoking retaliation. The picture that emerged was of a man who had used wealth and political connections to create a climate of fear where people knew better than to cross him. But many were tired of living under Vernon's shadow and would welcome the opportunity to see him held accountable. The critical breakthrough came when they visited Martha Henderson, the elderly widow who operated the town's telephone exchange. Mrs. Henderson had been listening to conversations for 40 years, and while she maintained strict confidentiality about private calls, she was willing to discuss those involving illegal activities or threats. "Vernon Coleman thinks his telephone calls are private," Mrs. Henderson said with obvious distaste. "But I've heard him making arrangements that would curl your hair, including conversations about tracking down his runaway property and making sure anyone who helped you would regret it for the rest of their lives." "Are you willing to testify about what you've heard?" Mercy asked. "Honey, I've been waiting 40 years for someone to have courage to stand up to that man. If there's finally a chance to see him get what he deserves, you can count on me." As they returned to Cal's farm to plan their next moves, both were encouraged by the community response. People were ready to stand up to Vernon if they could be convinced doing so would result in justice rather than simply making him angry. But they had also learned something disturbing. Vernon's search for Mercy was intensifying, and he was making increasingly desperate threats. Time was running out, and they needed to present their case to federal authorities before Vernon's network discovered what they were doing. "Cal," Mercy said, as they sat in his kitchen reviewing evidence, "we have enough documentation to prove Vernon has been systematically abusing me. But do we have enough to convince a federal marshal to take action against someone with Vernon's connections?" As Cal looked at the medical records, witness statements and documented evidence they had assembled, it was more than he had dared hope for, but he understood that taking on someone with Vernon's power would require an overwhelming case, leaving no room for doubt. "We have enough to get Marshal Patterson's attention," he said finally. "But you're right that we need to be absolutely certain our case is airtight before we make our move. Vernon will only get one chance to strike back, and we need to make sure the law will be on our side." As they prepared for what they knew would be the most dangerous phase of their campaign, Cal and Mercy reflected on how much their relationship had changed since that desperate night when she had begged him to kill her. She was no longer the broken, hopeless woman who had collapsed behind his barn, and he was no longer the lonely farmer slowly giving up on life. Together, they had discovered that even the most impossible challenges could be overcome when people were willing to risk everything for the chance to do what was right. Justice at last. 2 weeks after Mercy had first collapsed behind Cal's barn, Federal Marshal James Patterson arrived at the Thornton farm carrying arrest warrants that would either vindicate their dangerous gamble or destroy them all. The marshal was a lean, weathered man whose 20 years of federal law enforcement had taught him to distinguish between genuine injustice and local political squabbles. Cal and Mercy had spent the intervening days refining their evidence and preparing for this crucial meeting, knowing they would have only one opportunity to convince Marshal Patterson that Vernon's crimes warranted federal intervention. They had also hidden copies of all documentation in 3 separate locations, understanding Vernon would stop at nothing to destroy evidence against him. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Coleman," Marshal Patterson said as he settled into Cal's kitchen and began reviewing their materials, "I want you to understand the seriousness of what you're asking. Vernon Coleman has significant political influence, and arresting him without absolutely ironclad evidence would create problems reaching Washington." "Marshal," Mercy replied, her voice steady despite the stakes, "I understand the risks you're taking, but if we don't stop Vernon now, he'll spend the rest of his life making sure anyone who helped me pays the price." Marshal Patterson spent 3 hours methodically reviewing every piece of evidence. Dr. Morrison's medical records documenting 5 years of systematic abuse, witness statements from neighbors who had observed Vernon's violent behavior, Mrs. Henderson's testimony about threatening phone calls, and financial records showing how Vernon had used economic power to intimidate opponents. But the Marshal's expression grew particularly serious when he reviewed evidence of Vernon's attempts to use political connections to obstruct justice. "This changes everything," he said, as he read Klaus Brenner's detailed account of threats Vernon had made against federal investigators. "When someone tries to interfere with a federal investigation, it becomes a federal crime, regardless of their local influence." The breakthrough came when Marshal Patterson contacted Washington and learned that Vernon had already attracted federal attention for suspected tax evasion and illegal manipulation of government agriculture contracts during the Dust Bowl. The evidence Cal and Mercy had gathered provided missing pieces federal investigators needed to build a comprehensive case. "Mrs. Coleman," Marshal Patterson said as he prepared to leave, "I'll be honest about what happens next. We'll arrest Vernon tomorrow morning on federal charges including kidnapping, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and civil rights violations. But once we take him into custody, his lawyers and political allies will begin working immediately to get him released and retaliate against witnesses." "What does that mean for us?" Cal asked. "It means that for the next several months, until this case goes to trial, you'll both be living under federal protection. We can't guarantee your safety if Vernon makes bail and decides to eliminate witnesses." The federal operation that unfolded over the next 48 hours was unlike anything rural Oklahoma had ever witnessed. At dawn, Marshal Patterson and 6 other federal agents simultaneously raided Vernon's ranch, his business offices, and the homes of 3 associates suspected of helping him intimidate witnesses. Vernon was arrested while eating breakfast at his ranch house, and his reaction confirmed everything Mercy had told Cal about his character. He ranted about political connections, threatened agents with retaliation from powerful friends, and demanded to know which lying witnesses had dared speak against him. But federal agents were unmoved by his bluster, and within hours he was in federal detention awaiting arraignment on charges that could send him to prison for decades. News of Vernon Coleman's arrest spread through the region like wildfire, creating a sensation that attracted attention from newspapers, radio stations, and federal officials eager to demonstrate that the Roosevelt administration was serious about protecting ordinary citizens' rights against abuse by powerful local interests. For Cal and Mercy, the immediate aftermath was a time of profound adjustment as they tried to understand what the future might hold. They had achieved their goal of bringing Vernon to justice, but had also fundamentally changed their own lives in ways neither had fully anticipated. "Cal," Mercy said as they sat on his porch 3 days after Vernon's arrest, watching federal agents patrol his farm perimeter, "I realize I've never properly thanked you for what you've done. You saved my life, not just by refusing to kill me that first night, but by giving me courage to fight back instead of running away. Mercy, you don't need to thank me. Helping you fight Vernon is the first meaningful thing I've done since Rebecca died. You gave me purpose when I thought my life was over. What happens to us now? After the trial, after Vernon is convicted and sent to prison, what do we do then? Cal had been thinking about exactly that question, trying to envision a future neither had planned for, but both had earned through courage and determination. I've been hoping you might consider staying here, building a life on this farm with me. I know it's not much, and the land has been pretty much ruined, but with two people working together, we might be able to make something of it. Mercy smiled, and for the first time since Cal had known her, it was a smile carrying genuine happiness, rather than just relief from pain. Cal Thornton, are you asking me to marry you? I suppose I am, though I'm doing a pretty poor job of it. What I'm really asking is whether you'd be willing to take a chance on building something new with a stubborn farmer who thinks he can make dead land bloom again. The answer is yes, Mercy said without hesitation. But I want you to understand that I'm not just saying yes because I'm grateful. I'm saying yes because somewhere in the middle of this fight against Vernon, I fell in love with a man who was willing to risk everything to help a stranger, who refused to let me give up on myself even when I wanted to die. The trial of Vernon Coleman became a landmark case in federal civil rights law, establishing important precedents about the government's responsibility to protect citizens from systematic abuse by powerful local interests. Vernon's conviction on multiple federal charges resulted in a 20-year prison sentence and forfeiture of most assets, which were used to compensate victims and fund federal programs protecting domestic abuse survivors. 6 months after Vernon's conviction, Cal and Mercy were married in a simple ceremony at the Clearwater Methodist Church, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had risked their safety to help them build their case. Dr. Morrison served as Cal's best man, while Mrs. Henderson proudly walked Mercy down the aisle. The Thornton farm, which had been on the verge of failure when Mercy first arrived, began to prosper under their joint management as they implemented new farming techniques designed to restore soil and prevent future dust storms. Their success became a model for other farmers struggling to rebuild after the Dust Bowl devastation. But their most important success was the family they built together. 3 children who grew up understanding that their parents had overcome impossible odds to create a home where love was stronger than fear and justice more important than power. The story of how their mother had begged a stranger to kill her, only to discover he had something far more valuable to offer, became a family legend passed down through generations. 20 years after Vernon's conviction, Cal and Mercy sat on their porch, watching grandchildren play in restored fields that had once been barren dust, reflecting on the incredible journey from that desperate night to this moment of profound contentment. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had done what I asked that first night? Mercy asked, her hand intertwined with Cal's. Never, Cal replied firmly, because what we built together is so much better than anything I could have imagined. You asked me to kill you quickly, but what we did instead was kill the despair and fear that were destroying your life, and we replaced them with love and hope and the knowledge that good people can overcome any challenge when they're willing to fight for what's right. The story of Cal Thornton and Mercy Coleman proves that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a refusal to accept that hopelessness is inevitable. What started with a desperate woman's plea for death became a testament to the power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds, and the courage required to stand up against seemingly impossible odds. Today, the Thornton farm stands as a symbol of renewal and hope in a region once devastated by both natural disasters and human cruelty. The techniques Cal and Mercy developed for soil restoration have been adopted throughout the Great Plains, and their story has inspired countless survivors of domestic abuse to seek help and find strength to rebuild their lives. But perhaps the most important lesson from their journey is this: when we choose to offer help instead of turning away, when we refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable, when we believe that every human life has value worth fighting for, we don't just change someone else's story, we transform our own. Cal thought he was simply refusing to commit an act of violence. Instead, he discovered a love that would define the rest of his life and create a legacy of hope that would endure for generations. If this incredible story of second chances and the transformative power of love touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for a new beginning. Subscribe for more amazing tales that prove hope can triumph over despair. Don't forget to let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love hearing from our global family of believers in the power of human kindness. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's kindness changed the entire direction of your life? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly the inspiration someone else needs to believe that better days are possible.